Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we'll take a slow and quiet look at ancient civilizations, the old worlds that rose beside rivers, deserts, seas, and stone hills, and left behind cities, tablets, temples, tools, and stories that still shape the way we understand the past. If you enjoy these gentle journeys through history, you're always welcome to leave a like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments, perhaps where you're listening from tonight, or what calm subject you'd like to drift into next. For now, let the room grow still around you. Let the day loosen its grip. Imagine lamplight on clay, cool air moving through a courtyard, and the long silence of museum halls after closing time. And as the night settles in, we can begin slowly with the first quiet details of the ancient world. Ancient civilizations did not appear all at once. They formed gradually over many generations, as people learned how to settle near dependable water, how to store grain through changing seasons, and how to live together in larger and more permanent communities. Rivers were often the starting point, not because they made life effortless, but because they made life possible. In places where rain could not always be trusted, the yearly movement of water offered a rhythm that people could learn to depend on. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, and the Yellow River each created their own patterns of flooding, planting, and harvest. Those rivers could be generous, but they could also be destructive, rising too high, shifting course, or leaving fields buried in silt. Still, for many early communities, the river was a kind of living calendar. It told people when to mend levees, when to sow seed, and when to gather again around storage pits and ovens. Over time, small villages became towns, and towns became cities with rulers, priests, workers, and traders. What we call a civilization was really a long experiment in cooperation, memory, and adaptation, shaped by seasons, family networks, and the quiet pressure of survival. One of the most important changes in that long experiment was the rise of food surplus. When farming produced more than one household needed immediately, society could begin to separate into different kinds of work. Some people still labored in the fields, but others could specialize in pottery, weaving, building, record keeping, transport, metalwork, or ritual duties. That specialization changed everything slowly and profoundly. A community with surplus could support artisans whose skill improved year after year because they were no longer occupied entirely with finding the next meal. It could support administrators who counted jars of grain and assigned labor, and public spaces where people gathered for markets, ceremonies, or judgment. Surplus also created inequality, because stored food could be controlled, measured, guarded, and taxed. In a good year, abundance could feel like security. In a bad year, it could become power. In that quiet tension between plenty and authority, many ancient societies took shape, carrying both promise and imbalance within them. Writing emerged in that same broad atmosphere of growing complexity. It did not begin as poetry or philosophy, but as accounting, labels, lists, and practical records. A mark on clay might stand for a sack of barley, a sheep, a debt, a delivery, or a temple offering. At first, these marks were often attached to the ordinary business of life. Who owed what, which storehouse received which goods, what belonged to a shrine, or how much labor had been promised. But once a society develops writing, memory itself can be extended beyond the mind of any one person. The written sign does not tire, forget, or change its story in the telling. Very early texts were probably read aloud by specialists, in a world where literacy remained rare and highly respected. Before long, writing became part of administration, religion, law, and history. It also became a bridge between the living and the dead, preserving names and offerings for ancestors and gods. The ancient world was not only built with stone and brick, it was also built with lists, measures, seals, and names carefully preserved against forgetting. Ancient cities were often noisy, crowded places, but their earliest foundations were surprisingly fragile. Mud brick walls could dissolve in heavy rain if they were not carefully maintained. Wooden beams could rot in damp air. Reed mats could wear thin, and thatch could catch fire easily in a dry season. Even the strongest-looking settlement could require constant repair, as people patched doorways, resurfaced floors, and rebuilt ovens after each cycle of use. In many places, great settlements had to be rebuilt again and again on the same ground, layer upon layer. That is one reason archaeology often uncovers not one city, but several cities stacked together like pages in a book. A buried street may sit beneath a later courtyard, and a collapsed house beneath a newer shrine. The earth itself became an archive, preserving repeated human effort in ways no living memory could match. When archaeologists brush soil from a pot shard or a wall fragment, they are often reading the remains of many small decisions: where to place a hearth, how to orient a doorway, when to abandon a damaged building, and when to begin again. Long before modern maps, people already understood that geography shaped destiny in subtle and powerful ways. A city near a river had different needs from one near the sea. A desert kingdom moved differently from a forest state. A mountain people defended narrow passes, while a coastal people learned to read winds, tides, and channels. In some places, a fortified hill offered safety and visibility. In others, a floodplain offered fertility but little natural protection. Ancient civilization was never one single pattern. It was a collection of solutions, each one adapted to place, climate, and local imagination. Some societies rose around caravan routes, where camels or pack animals could cross long, dry distances. Others clustered along fertile deltas or lake shores, where fishing and farming could support dense populations. Even belief systems often reflected the local environment. A people who lived with seasonal drought might imagine gods of rain and renewal. A people surrounded by mountains might place sacred importance on peaks, caves, or high sanctuaries. In this way, geography did not merely surround ancient civilizations. It helped shape their stories, their work, and even the way they understood the heavens. Many ancient societies were deeply ceremonial, but not in a way that was separate from everyday life. Ritual often blended into work, harvest, childbirth, marriage, and burial, moving quietly through the ordinary rhythm of the year. A boundary between sacred and practical did exist, yet it was thinner than it is in many modern cultures. When people poured wine, baked bread, ground grain, or hammered metal, they might also be honoring a god, an ancestor, or a protective spirit. A threshold might be marked with oil, a new house might be blessed, or a field might receive offerings before the first plough passed through it. In some traditions, the ancestors were understood to remain near, watching the family line and sharing in its fortunes. In others, ritual specialists interpreted dreams, omens, stars, or the flight of birds to see whether an action was favored. Even so, these beliefs were not always abstract or solemn. They were part of lived experience, woven into the texture of daily labor. The ordinary and the divine moved close together, so that a meal, a burial, or the opening of a market could carry both practical and spiritual meaning. Food was one of the clearest signs of civilization's growth, and also one of its most intimate foundations. Bread, beer, porridge, olives, dates, lentils, fish, and preserved meats fed large populations and supported labor. Different regions developed their own staples, but the principle was similar everywhere. Reliable agriculture made settled life possible. Kitchens, ovens, grinding stones, storage jars, and fermentation pits may seem modest compared with palaces or temples, yet they reveal the real basis of ancient power. A civilization begins in part with the ability to feed itself day after day, through heat and cold, drought and flood, feast and famine. In many places, grain was more than food. It was a measure of stability, a form of wealth, and a sign that the community had crossed from immediate survival into planning. Archaeologists sometimes find charred seeds, broken jars, or flour residue in stone mortars, and these small traces can be as revealing as a royal inscription. They show what people ate, how they stored provisions, and how carefully they learned to stretch harvests across the year. In this sense, the ancient kitchen was as important as the throne room. Trade linked distant cultures long before the idea of a global economy existed. Copper, tin, lapis lazuli, incense, shells, cloth, grain, oil, and timber moved along river routes, sea lanes, and caravan paths. A city without nearby resources could still thrive if it controlled exchange, taxed passage, or became a meeting point between regions. Merchants, messengers, port officials, caravan guards, and translators became essential figures in the ancient world. Their work was often repetitive and practical, but it created connections that reached far beyond any single city. Through trade, styles and ideas traveled too. A pattern on a bowl, a seal impression, a type of bead, or a religious symbol could wander far beyond its place of origin and take on new meanings in a different land. Sometimes trade was peaceful and profitable. Sometimes it was precarious, depending on weather, politics, or banditry. Ships could be delayed by storms, caravans by sand, and treaties by rivalry. Still, exchange remained one of the great forces of ancient life, carrying not only goods but also stories, technologies, and tastes from one horizon to another. And beneath all of this there was time. Ancient civilizations endured for centuries, sometimes for millennia, but they were never fixed in place. They rose, changed, merged, fractured, and were absorbed into later cultures. Dynasties replaced dynasties, capitals shifted, languages evolved. Old customs survived under new names, while some traditions vanished so completely that only fragments remain. What survives is only a portion of what once existed, and often only the portion that happened to endure in dry soil, buried ruins, or durable stone. Even so, that portion is enough to show how inventive, resilient, and carefully organized early human societies could be. The ancient world was not silent. It was simply speaking in clay, stone, ash, wool, bone, and memory. Its voices arrived to us slowly, through broken objects and partial texts, through the grain of a wall and the shape of a jar, through the patient work of people who lived and died beneath the same sky we still see now. One of the clearest ways we understand ancient civilizations is through their cities, and city planning was often more deliberate than people expect. Some settlements grew slowly and organically, with winding lanes shaped by habit, family lines, and the lay of the land. Others were arranged with surprising care, using grids, courtyards, storage districts, workshops, and ceremonial centers. In some places, streets were narrow enough to hold shade for much of the day, which mattered greatly in hot climates. In others, broad avenues helped processions move in orderly lines or guided water runoff during seasonal rains. Even the placement of homes could reflect quiet logic. The need to keep animals close, to reach wells quickly, to stay near markets, or to remain within a short walk of a shrine or administrative center. To modern eyes, an ancient city might look crowded, but that density often worked as a form of efficiency. Shared walls saved materials. Central squares supported trade, announcements, and festivals. Rooflines, stairways, and storage areas all served practical purposes. A city was not only a place to live, it was a machine for organizing daily life, one that shaped how people moved, cooked, worked, and gathered. Walls were another defining feature, and they carried meanings that were both practical and symbolic. They protected against raiders, stray animals, and sudden unrest, but they also announced identity. A wall said that a community had the labor, planning, and collective will to build something large and lasting. The act of gathering stone, mud brick, timber, or packed earth into a continuous boundary could take years, sometimes generations. Gates controlled entry, tolls, and trade. Watchtowers offered early warning, and guard posts created rhythms of inspection and authority. Yet walls were not always purely military. They could mark sacred precincts, palace zones, or administrative quarters, separating ordinary streets from spaces reserved for ritual, storage, or elite access. In some traditions, walls were linked to cosmic order, as if the city itself were a small protected version of the world. Even so, archaeological evidence suggests that many walls were repaired repeatedly, patched in haste after damage, widened, lowered, or abandoned altogether as political conditions changed. The line between defense and ceremony was often very thin, and sometimes the same gate that welcomed merchants by day became a controlled threshold for processions by night. In many ancient societies, the palace and the temple stood close to each other, sometimes physically and politically connected. That arrangement reveals something important about how power worked. Kings, priests, scribes, and officials often depended on one another in ways that are easy to overlook from a modern distance. A ruler might present himself as chosen by the gods, while temple institutions managed food supplies, calendars, and record keeping. In some cases, temples functioned like storehouses, landholders, treasuries, and schools all at once. They may have held grain for redistribution during shortages, collected offerings, or oversaw workers attached to sacred estates. The palace, meanwhile, often handled diplomacy, military planning, and taxation. Governance was not just about force, it was about legitimacy, timing, and the public performance of order. Ceremonies could confirm a ruler's place in the world, and audiences before a throne might be carefully staged to show hierarchy. Even the architecture reinforced these ideas, with courtyards leading to audience halls and sanctuaries connected to routes of procession. In that sense, stone and mud brick were never mute. They helped explain who had authority, who prayed for it, and who was expected to maintain it. Calendars mattered deeply because ancient people lived in close conversation with the sky. They watched the sun, moon, stars, and seasonal patterns to decide when to plant, harvest, travel, or honor a deity. For farmers, knowing the first signs of a coming flood or monsoon could mean the difference between security and hunger. For priests and court astronomers, the heavens offered a way to measure time, and perhaps to make sense of uncertainty. The sky was not separate from life on Earth. It was a living schedule, a clock that moved slowly enough to be studied over many generations. Eclipses, solstices, and planetary motions could be interpreted as omens or messages, though the meaning varied widely from one culture to another. Some records were practical, noting dates and intervals with careful consistency. Others were ceremonial, linking celestial events to royal legitimacy or sacred anniversaries. Skilled observers tracked these cycles across long spans of years, sometimes from temple roofs or open courtyards, and their records became some of the most valuable knowledge in the ancient world. To sit with those calendars is to imagine people looking upward in the evening light, noting the position of a bright star, and trusting that the order above could help steady life below. Material culture gives us another quiet window into daily life, often more intimate than grand monuments or official inscriptions. A broken bowl, a spindle whirl, a cooking pot, a grinding stone, or a worn doorway step can tell us more about ordinary routines than a royal proclamation. Archaeologists pay close attention to these smaller objects because they reveal household habits that written sources often ignore. How was food prepared? Were meals cooked slowly over clay hearths or in portable vessels? How was cloth spun, dyed, or mended? How were children cared for, and what kinds of toys, tools, or storage containers surrounded them? A house may leave behind only a scatter of shards and ash, yet those remains can suggest a surprising amount about labor and domestic rhythm. Some pots were made for boiling grain, others for storing oil, others for carrying water from a communal source. A polished stone or a soot-blackened surface can still hint at repeated touch. Ancient civilizations were made not only of monuments, but also of repeated gestures, many of which have been preserved in fragments. In that way, archaeology often feels like listening to a conversation that has been broken into pieces, with meaning recovered slowly, one small detail at a time. Craftsmanship was highly specialized in many regions, and specialization often emerged gradually as communities invested in knowledge that had to be practiced over and over. Potters learned the behavior of clay and fire, knowing how much water to add and how long a vessel could dry before it cracked. Metalworkers mastered temperature, ore sources, and alloy mixtures, reading the glow of a furnace with patient eyes. Carpenters understood joints, tension, grain, and the hidden strength of wood. Stonecutters learned how to split blocks along natural lines, while scribes trained for years to copy signs accurately and maintain administrative records. This knowledge was often transmitted through apprenticeship, within families, workshops, or temple schools. It was practical learning, but also cultural inheritance. A finished object, whether a jar or a ceremonial blade, represented patience more than spectacle. The skill itself was often hidden inside the object, invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. Sometimes these crafts were tied to ritual, so that the making of something could be as meaningful as its use. In many societies, the best artisans were respected not only for their output, but for their disciplined understanding of materials. Their work traveled widely too, passing as gifts, trade goods, or diplomatic offerings across long routes of exchange. Ancient people also cared intensely about color, though many surviving artifacts now appear faded or muted by time. We often see stone, clay, or metal in its weathered state, and forget that the ancient world may once have been bright with pigment. Textiles may have been rich with plant dyes, mineral pigments, and imported substances that were expensive to obtain and delicate to preserve. Red, blue, yellow, black, white, and green all carried symbolic meanings in different contexts. Red might suggest life, blood, power, danger, or protection. Blue could evoke water, sky, or divine realms. White might signal purity, mourning, or ritual clarity. Black could be associated with fertility, night, the underworld, or the rich earth itself. These meanings were rarely fixed in a single universal way, and they changed from place to place. Still, color clearly mattered in clothing, wall painting, pottery, and ceremonial objects. A surviving statue may look austere now, but in its original setting it might have been painted in vivid layers, with inlaid eyes, gilded accents, or patterned textiles nearby. Even architecture could be colorized through plaster, glaze, or painted relief. The ancient world was probably far more visually varied than many museum rooms first suggest, and much of that brightness has simply been lost to weather, burial, and time. Seals and stamps were widely used because trust had to be created at a distance. In large societies, people needed ways to recognize ownership, authority, and origin without meeting the sender face to face. A clay seal impression could identify an owner, a temple, a merchant, or a royal office. It could close a storage jar, validate a document, or authenticate a shipment. The same small object might travel with goods, accompany a bundle of tablets, or press a distinctive mark into soft clay before it hardened. In a world without digital records, these marks carried large authority. They turned ownership into visible form. They also reflected concern for control, because if a seal was broken, it could show that a container had been opened or tampered with. Some seals were carved with animals, deities, geometric forms, or scenes of ritual and power. Others were worn as personal items and may have served almost like signatures. The beauty of these objects is often tiny, visible only when examined closely. Yet their effect was immense. They helped move grain, cloth, oil, and correspondence through systems that depended on accountability. In that sense, a little bit of clay and carved stone could stand in for a person's trust, authority, and presence. Language itself was a powerful marker of civilization, and it could reveal both continuity and change. Some cultures used one major language for administration and another for ritual. Others adapted writing systems from neighbors, changing signs to fit local speech and local habits of thought. Scripts could be pictographic, syllabic, alphabetic, or combinations of all three, and each system reflected practical needs as well as cultural choices. Writing was never just a tool. It was also a way of seeing the world. A sign might stand for a sound, an object, an idea, or several layers at once, depending on context. Scribes had to learn not only shapes, but conventions, formulas, and preferred ways of arranging information. In some places, writing was reserved for elites, priests, or administrators. In others, it spread more widely through trade or education. Ancient texts can feel formal, but they often hide traces of everyday life: inventories, complaints, prayers, contracts, receipts, names, and lists. Even when a script is still only partly understood, its existence tells us that people wanted memory to outlast speech. They wanted offerings recorded, debts remembered, laws preserved, and blessings repeated exactly. Writing gave civilization a longer breath, and because the ancient world was so interconnected, no civilization developed in complete isolation. Ideas drifted across mountains, deserts, rivers, and seas. They were borrowed, transformed, and reimagined in places far from their origin. A city might copy a foreign motif on pottery, a foreign musical instrument, or a foreign method of fortification, then adapt it to local taste. A religious image could be borrowed and given a new name. A style of beadwork might travel with traders and settle into a different tradition. Technologies moved as well, along with stories, weights, measures, and diplomatic habits. Sometimes this exchange was peaceful, and sometimes it followed conquest or migration. Either way, contact changed people. Civilization in the ancient sense was never a closed room. It was more like a long corridor of exchanging voices, where each culture heard the echo of others and answered in its own language. Religion in ancient civilizations was often woven into the structure of the state, so deeply that it can be difficult to separate belief from administration. A temple was not only a sacred building with incense in the air and hymns echoing through stone courtyards. It could also be a place where crops were stored, accounts were recorded, land was managed, and workers were organized. In some cities, the temple complex functioned like a stable heart at the center of a changing body. Kings might rise and fall, borders might shift, and dynasties might be replaced, yet the temple staff could continue the same chants, the same calculations, and the same seasonal observances. Priests and priestesses often served as specialists in more than devotion. They kept calendars, supervised offerings, copied texts, and preserved traditions that linked the present to a remembered past. In that way, sacred architecture became practical architecture. The same space that held prayer could also hold grain, records, and the quiet machinery of daily life. Deities in ancient civilizations frequently reflected the landscape around them, as if people looked at the world and gave shape to its most powerful forces. In river valleys, gods could belong to the waters that flooded and nourished the fields. In coastal regions, divine figures might protect sailors, guide fishing communities, or command the deep. Storm gods appeared where thunder and lightning dominated the imagination, while grain goddesses and fertility spirits emerged in societies that depended on harvests and careful planting. Even household spirits often seemed to answer ordinary concerns: safety, health, childbirth, the security of the home. These gods were not always distant or abstract. They could feel close to the routines of kneading bread, mending nets, or watching the sky for rain. Myth in this sense was not a separate dream world floating above reality. It was a language for describing reality itself, giving names and stories to what people feared, hoped for, and could not fully control. Many ancient myths also served as moral and social maps, guiding listeners through questions of order and disorder, justice and betrayal, hospitality and arrogance. A story about a king who honors the gods might quietly teach the duties of leadership. A tale of a trickster outwitting the proud could warn against vanity. A journey into the underworld might give shape to grief, reminding a community that death is a passage to be faced rather than ignored. Some stories describe the founding of cities, the right of rulers to govern, or the sacred responsibilities of marriage and kinship. Others explained why the seasons turn, why people argue, or why the world contains both blessing and suffering. A flood myth may preserve memory of an ancient disaster, perhaps remembered and reshaped over generations. A divine marriage might symbolize the joining of lands or peoples. Because these stories were retold again and again, they remained flexible, able to absorb new meanings without losing their emotional force. Their endurance came partly from this openness, this ability to remain familiar while still adapting to new listeners. Funerary practice reveals how seriously many ancient cultures regarded the dead, and how thin the boundary between the living and the departed could feel. Burial customs varied widely, yet the underlying concern was often the same. The dead needed care. They might require food, protection, names spoken aloud, or offerings placed nearby. Tombs could be simple pits in the earth, carved chambers, painted family spaces, or monumental structures built to last for generations. Some communities cremated the body, while others preserved it with great attention. Grave goods might include jewelry, tools, pots, weapons, cosmetics, or figurines intended to accompany the deceased. In some places, periodic visits to tombs were as important as the burial itself, turning remembrance into a repeated act rather than a single event. Cemeteries, pyramids, mastabas, chamber tombs, and even small household graves all carried the same quiet message in different forms. The dead were not entirely gone, and relationship could continue across the threshold of death. Mummification in Egypt is perhaps the most famous example of ancient concern for preservation, but it was far from the only way human beings tried to hold on to the body and what it represented. In Egypt, the careful removal of moisture, the wrapping of linen, and the placement of the body in a sealed environment reflected a profound hope that identity could endure if the body remained recognizable. Yet preservation elsewhere could happen through different means, some intentional and some accidental. A body buried in dry desert air might survive because the climate itself resists decay. A manuscript sealed in a jar or hidden in a cave might remain intact for centuries. A wooden object buried in peat, frost, or arid soil may emerge from the earth almost startlingly preserved. What survives from antiquity is often the result of both human intention and natural circumstance. The ancient world is therefore partly known through careful burial, and partly through the luck of stone, dryness, cold, and silence. Ancestor reverence was another deeply rooted feature of ancient life, binding families together across time. The dead were not always imagined as distant shades, forgotten once the funeral ended. In many societies, ancestors remained present through ritual meals, offerings, prayers, and the repeated speaking of names. Family altars and tombside ceremonies helped maintain continuity between generations. The living could seek guidance, blessing, or legitimacy through those who came before. Inheritance was not only a transfer of land or property. It was also a transfer of memory, obligation, and identity. A house remembered its dead. A lineage carried its story backward as much as forward. By honoring ancestors, people affirmed that they belonged to something larger than an individual lifetime, something extended and patient, where the quiet influence of the departed still shaped the present. Dreams, too, carried unusual importance in ancient civilizations, often arriving at the edge of sleep like messages from an unseen place. They could be interpreted as warnings, blessings, omens, or instructions. A ruler might consult dream interpreters before a campaign. A priest might consider a dream as a sign from a deity. An ordinary person might wake with the sense that a deceased relative had visited or that some hidden danger had been revealed. Many ancient cultures produced dream manuals or lists of dream symbols, suggesting that people wanted to organize these nighttime experiences into something legible. The logic was not always scientific in the modern sense, but it was carefully observed. Sleep was not thought of as empty time. It was a threshold state, a place where messages could arrive, where memory and fear mingled, and where the mind seemed to move beyond its daytime habits. Even now, the ancient fascination with dreams feels familiar, because dreams still carry that same strange mixture of mystery and intimacy. Sacrifice, although often unsettling to modern readers, was usually understood in ancient settings as a form of exchange. It was not simply loss. It was a way of maintaining balance with powers greater than oneself. Communities offered food, drink, incense, flowers, animals, or crafted objects in hopes of receiving divine favor, protection, or good fortune. The offering itself mattered, but so did the gesture, the timing, the words spoken, and the place where the gift was presented. In some cultures, sacrifice marked important transitions such as harvests, coronations, funerals, or military victories. In others, it reinforced communal identity by drawing people together around a shared ritual center. The same object could be both sacred and status-laden, a precious vessel, a fine textile, a rare metal figure. In this way, ritual and economy overlapped. Offering something valuable was a sign of devotion, but also a visible expression of social standing and collective participation in the sacred order of the world. Many sacred texts in ancient civilizations were designed to be spoken aloud, not merely read in silence. Their repeated phrases, balanced lines, and rhythmic structures made them easier to memorize and transmit across generations. In a world where manuscripts were precious and literacy limited, the human voice was often the main vessel of continuity. Oral tradition remained central even after writing spread, because performance could carry emotional force, communal memory, and authority in ways that text alone could not. A hymn recited in a temple, a genealogy recounted in a royal court, or a myth performed at a festival might feel different each time, even if the words were familiar. The cadence of the speaker, the pauses, the setting, and the audience all shaped meaning. Priests, scribes, bards, and storytellers therefore served as keepers of civilization's memory, carrying forward not just words, but the living texture of how those words were meant to sound. And beneath the formal religion of kings and temples, private belief continued in smaller, more intimate forms that touched everyday life. People wore amulets for protection, carried charms for luck, placed figurines near doorways, and kept house shrines where a lamp might burn quietly in the evening. Simple prayers could be spoken before sleep, before travel, before childbirth, or in moments of illness and fear. These practices reveal a domestic side of ancient spirituality, one less visible in grand inscriptions, but no less important. A civilization was not only built in palaces and temples, it was also sustained in kitchens, courtyards, workshops, and bedrooms, where individuals sought comfort against uncertainty. Ancient worlds were vast enough to support empires and elaborate priesthoods, yet intimate enough to fit inside a small room, a tucked-away object, or a whispered ritual performed just before falling asleep. Ancient agriculture was a careful balance between labor and uncertainty. Long before machines or weather reports, farmers had to read the land itself. They watched the color of soil, the timing of rains, the height of river water, the behavior of insects, the condition of seeds, and the texture of the wind. A successful harvest was never simply a matter of working harder. It depended on memory, patience, and attention to small changes that repeated across generations. In many farming communities, the knowledge of planting was not written in books at first, but carried in conversation, family practice, ritual calendars, and the quiet habits of daily life. One household might know when a certain bird returned, or when a hill slope warmed enough for sowing, while another knew which field held moisture longest after a storm. These details mattered because ancient agriculture was always local. What worked beside one river, on one plain, or in one valley might fail only a few miles away. People learned to cooperate because no family could control the whole cycle alone. Soil had to be prepared, seed had to be saved, weeds had to be pulled, and grain had to be gathered before birds, rain, or spoilage took it away. In that sense, civilization grew from repeated acts of observation. It was not only about producing food, it was about remembering the shape of a season and trusting that the land would respond again. Irrigation was one of the great technologies of the ancient world. In dry regions especially, Canals, ditches, levees, basins, reservoirs, and water-lifting devices made cultivation possible where rainfall alone would not have been enough. These systems could turn scrubland into fields and extend agriculture into places that might otherwise have remained sparse or seasonal. Yet irrigation was never a simple victory over nature. It created new responsibilities, new risks, and new forms of dependence. Channels filled with silt and had to be cleared. Earthen banks weakened after storms and needed repair. Water had to be shared in ways that seemed fair enough to prevent conflict, but exact enough to keep crops alive. In some places, ancient texts and inscriptions suggest that irrigation management could become deeply political, because whoever controlled the flow also influenced harvests, taxes, and labor schedules. Even the rhythm of daily life could be shaped by the opening of a sluice gate or the diversion of a stream. Water was never merely a resource. It was a timetable, a legal question, a communal obligation, and a source of tension. It also carried a strange beauty, the sound of moving water through lined channels, the damp smell of earth after flooding, the sight of green fields emerging from a dry landscape. For many ancient people, irrigation was not only engineering. It was the careful art of living with uncertainty. Domesticated animals also changed everything. Their presence made work lighter in some ways and more complex in others, binding humans to living creatures whose needs had to be understood day by day. Oxen pulled ploughs and carts, slowly turning soil that would have been much harder to cultivate by hand alone. Donkeys carried goods across roads, desert tracks, and trade routes, especially where terrain made wheeled transport difficult. Sheep and goats offered milk, meat, wool, hides, and dung that could be used as fuel or fertilizer. In some regions, horses transformed warfare, travel, and state power, giving certain societies new speed and range. Yet animals were not just tools. They were partners in survival, and their care required knowledge of breeding, feeding, shelter, and movement. Herds had to be watched through changing seasons. Young animals had to be protected. Sick animals had to be treated or separated. Pastoral communities moved with the rhythm of pasture and water, while farming communities relied on animals for traction, transport, and daily domestic work. In reality, these two ways of life overlapped more than older histories sometimes admit. Farmers kept animals. Herders traded with farmers. Cities depended on both. Even the smell of ancient life was shaped by livestock. Hay, dung, leather, wool, milk, and dust all mixed into the atmosphere of settlements large and small. The quiet economy of animals ran beneath the louder stories of kings and conquests. Food storage mattered as much as production. In many ancient societies, the harvest itself was only the beginning of survival. Grain, dried legumes, oils, salted foods, and preserved fruits had to be protected from moisture, pests, rot, theft, and fire. Granaries, pits, jars, baskets, sealed rooms, and raised platforms all served the same essential purpose. They extended the life of abundance into the leaner months that would inevitably follow. A civilization with strong storage systems could endure droughts, tax collections, trade interruptions, and harsh winters more effectively than one that lived only from day to day. Stored food also created options. It could feed workers during construction projects, sustain travelers, support armies, or be redistributed in times of scarcity. Because of this, surplus became a measure of power. Whoever controlled storage often controlled not just grain, but stability itself. Some rulers advertised their ability to fill granaries as a sign of legitimacy, while temple institutions and palace administrations kept careful accounts of incoming and outgoing provisions. Yet even in modest households, storage was a form of foresight. A family that had enough dried grain or sealed jars could weather an unexpected illness, a delayed caravan, or a poor season. Deep inside ancient administration, the humble granary was often as important as the throne, because the promise of tomorrow depended on what could be saved today. Bread and beer in Mesopotamia, grain porridges in many regions, flatbreads in desert zones, and rice cultures farther east all show how central cereals were to ancient diets. But the ancient table was far more varied than it may first seem. Herbs gathered from fields or courtyards, fruits ripened in orchards, oils pressed from seeds and olives, legumes simmered into stews, dairy products from sheep, goats, or cattle, fish from rivers and coasts, fermented sauces and seasonal vegetables all contributed to daily meals. Recipes were shaped by climate, class, religion, and availability. In some places, meals may have been fragrant with coriander, garlic, onion, or sesame. In others, they were defined by millet, barley, dates, lentils, or freshwater fish. Archaeology helps recover these patterns through charred seeds, storage jars, grinding stones, animal bones, residue analysis, and traces left on pottery. Yet even these clues offer only part of the story. Eating was not just nutritional, it was social. It marked workdays, festivals, family gatherings, and moments of offering to the divine. What people ate and when could reflect identity as much as environment. Access varied widely. Elites could enjoy more variety, sweeter flavors, and richer fats, while poorer households often depended on the plain strength of staple grains. Still, across this great range, food remained a shared anchor of ancient life. Warm bread, steam from a pot, the scent of crushed herbs, and the slow comfort of a meal prepared with what the land could provide. Markets were places of exchange, but also of information. Within them, the movement of goods and the movement of words happened together. News, rumor, gossip, price changes, travel reports, and political whispers circulated alongside produce, cloth, pottery, tools, and animals. A market square could feel noisy and layered, full of overlapping voices, the call of sellers, the clink of coins or tokens, the smell of grain, fish, oil, smoke, or spices, and the constant shifting of people who had come from different quarters of a city or from distant villages beyond its walls. Markets connected rural producers to urban consumers, bringing harvests into towns and finished goods back into the countryside. They also created a rare kind of social meeting place. Farmers, artisans, traders, messengers, tax collectors, pilgrims, and strangers might all stand within the same space, if only briefly. Because of that, markets were often among the most mixed environments in ancient society, where language, accent, dress, and custom encountered one another in ordinary commerce. Some markets were regulated by civic authorities, others by temples or local elites, and some may have operated with a looser, more improvised rhythm. In every case, the market was more than a place to buy and sell. It was a pulse point of civilization, where one could measure not only prices, but moods, anxieties, and the slow spread of information. Weights and measures made all of this possible. Without shared standards, trade would have been uncertain, taxation inconsistent, and large building projects difficult to coordinate. Standard units for length, mass, and volume allowed rulers, merchants, and officials to work across broad areas without relying entirely on personal trust. This was not only a technical matter, it was also a political one. A ruler who could standardize measures could standardize authority, because the same unit used in one city could be recognized in another, and claims about grain, silver, timber, or cloth could be compared more reliably. Small stone weights, marked rods, balancing scales, and measuring vessels may look simple now, but they were crucial instruments of administration. They made accounting possible. They helped settle disputes. They allowed workers to be paid, taxes to be collected, and building materials to be ordered with some confidence that everyone meant the same thing. In surviving records, ancient societies often reveal how carefully they watched these details. The smallest discrepancy in a measure could matter in a warehouse, a market, a temple offering, or a royal storehouse. Behind the broad drama of states and empires, there was always this quieter language of calibration. Civilization depended on shared units, because shared units made cooperation easier, and cooperation made scale possible. Labor was organized in many forms: and the ancient world was built through a mixture of freedom and coercion that modern readers must not overlook. Some projects used free citizens who served temporarily or for wages. Some relied on corvée labor, where people were required to work for the state for set periods. Some depended on enslaved people whose labor was extracted through ownership and violence. This is one of the hardest realities of ancient civilization. Monuments, roads, fields, fortifications, temples, and palaces often rested on unequal labor systems that official inscriptions tended to celebrate indirectly or hide entirely. The polished stone, straight wall, or raised terrace might appear as a triumph of order, but behind it were hours of carrying, cutting, digging, lifting, mixing, and hauling. Tools could be simple and the work could be exhausting. Yet the laborers themselves were not always faceless. Some names survive in tablets or records. Some groups are remembered only in fragments, while others remain entirely invisible except through the scale of the works they left behind. To understand ancient civilization fully, one must see not only the king issuing commands, but the workers whose hands made those commands real. Even the rhythms of labor had texture. The scrape of a hoe, the heat of a quarry, the dust of a roadbed, the strain of ropes under load, the repetition of tasks done in the same place for many days. Splendor was often built through effort that received little praise. Even luxury goods often originated in ordinary craft systems. A fine textile began with fibers that had to be cleaned, spun, twisted, and woven. Ornate metalwork began with ore extraction, fuel, smelting, hammering, and polishing. A painted vessel began with clay gathered from the ground, shaped by hand or wheel, dried, fired, and decorated. A gilded object that ended up in a tomb or palace may have passed through many skilled hands long before anyone admired its final shine. The visible finish hides the longer chain of effort beneath it. Craft production was often organized in workshops, households, guild-like groups, or state-controlled facilities, depending on the society and period. Some artisans worked near courts and temples, while others made goods for local exchange or seasonal fairs. Their knowledge was practical but also refined through repetition. They understood how heat changed a metal, how moisture affected clay, how thread tension altered cloth, how dyes deepened with age. In some traditions, craft itself carried prestige, but even when it did not, it remained essential. Fine objects were not isolated miracles. They were the end point of many ordinary materials transformed by time, skill, and patience. To look at an ancient luxury object carefully is to see the labor folded inside it, layer by layer, like a memory hidden in the grain of wood or the surface of bronze. And still, despite hierarchy and hardship, ancient communities were resilient. They adapted to floods, droughts, political upheaval, migration, war, and shifting trade networks. They learned to rebuild after damage, to store what could be stored, to move what had to be moved, and to keep plant, animal, and family life going through uncertainty. Agriculture, storage, exchange, and labor all formed part of a slow human answer to instability. When one route failed, another opened. When one harvest fell short, people relied on reserves, networks, and shared obligations. When a city changed rulers, its fields still had to be sown. When a river shifted course, canals had to be rethought. This long adaptability is one of the most remarkable things about ancient civilization. It was not a single invention, nor a perfect system, nor a story of effortless progress. It was a set of habits, many of them humble, that helped people endure the year, and then the next one after that. In the background of empires and monuments was something quieter and more enduring, the patient human practice of making enough, saving enough, and remembering enough to begin again. One of the most remarkable aspects of ancient civilizations is how much of daily life survived in writing, sometimes in places that seem almost too humble to have mattered at all. Inscriptions on stone, clay tablets, papyrus, wax tablets, bronze, and pottery recorded laws, prayers, property lists, letters, dedications, receipts, and even casual notes. Some of these documents were formal, carefully arranged, and meant to endure. Others were strikingly ordinary. A complaint about a missing garment, a record of grain, a label for a jar, or a list of deliveries can feel very close to modern life, with its small responsibilities and unfinished errands. In that sense, writing did more than preserve information. It preserved the texture of everyday existence. It gave people a way to hold speech beyond the moment of speaking, and that changed the scale of memory. Instead of relying only on what elders could recite or what officials could remember, a civilization could leave behind traces that outlasted a single conversation, a single season, even a single reign. Scribes occupied a special position in many societies because literacy was rare, demanding, and valuable. Training could take years, and writing systems often involved thousands of signs, specialized formulas, and a disciplined familiarity with administrative language. A scribe was not only a copier of words. In many places, the scribe was also an accountant, an archivist, a diplomat, a petitioner, and sometimes a literary artist. Their work moved between the practical and the ceremonial. They might calculate rations in the morning, draft a letter in the afternoon, and copy a sacred text by lamplight. In courts and temples, the ability to read and write created a quiet but powerful authority. Through scribes, administrations could remember taxes, treaties, offerings, and inventories. They helped a state notice what had been collected, what had been promised, and what still remained unsettled. The power of a written sign was enormous because it could outlast the voice that made it, and because it could be carried far from the person who first spoke it. Libraries in the ancient world were not always libraries in the modern sense, with public reading rooms and rows of matching volumes. Some were archive rooms attached to temples or palaces, where tablets were stacked in baskets, shelves, or boxes. Others were collections of clay tablets, rolls, or manuscript fragments stored in chests and niches, protected from dampness, dust, and careless handling. Their purpose was preservation, administration, and learning, though those purposes often overlapped. A temple archive might preserve ritual instructions alongside tax accounts. A royal repository might keep diplomatic correspondence near astronomical records. A library was a place where a civilization tried to remember itself, not only in the grand way of epics and histories, but in the patient way of lists, labels, and catalogues. Even a damaged archive can be breathtaking, because it shows just how carefully people once tried to hold knowledge in place, trusting that the effort to keep a text safe was itself a meaningful act. Some ancient texts were copied repeatedly for teaching, and the repetition itself became part of education. Students learned to write by reproducing model phrases, proverbs, and stories, often on tablets that could be smoothed and reused. Education commonly began with practical formulas before moving toward poetry, law, or sacred material. A student might spend long hours tracing the same line, learning not only the shapes of signs, but also the rhythm of correct usage. Classroom tablets, scribal exercises, and repeated drills reveal the discipline behind literacy. They also reveal a patient pedagogy. To become educated was often to join a tradition of repetition as much as originality, to internalize a shared cultural memory before attempting anything new. In that world, copying was not a lesser skill. It was the path by which knowledge became stable enough to survive. In many cultures, literature was closely tied to power, but it was never limited to power alone. Epic poems could praise kings, preserve ancestral lineages, or justify military campaigns. Hymns could declare divine favor and align a ruler with the gods. Law codes could present social order as timeless, as if custom had always existed in the same shape. Yet literature also carried doubt, lament, satire, wisdom, and personal reflection. Some texts questioned fate, some described suffering, and some seemed to speak quietly from a private interior world. A prayer scratched onto a wall or a poetic complaint preserved on clay can feel startlingly intimate. Ancient voices sometimes reach us not as polished monuments, but as fragments of emotion, grief at a loss, longing for home, gratitude for a recovered blessing, or wonder at the turning of the sky. These are small human moments, and they have a way of making the distant past feel near. Letters are especially moving because they preserve direct human contact. A message to a relative, a request for supplies, a report from a frontier, or a note about illness can open a small window into private life. Through letters, the ancient world becomes less distant. We hear not only emperors and priests, but households, friendships, disputes, errands, and concerns about weather, health, and money. Some letters are formal, written with careful respect. Others are blunt, affectionate, impatient, or anxious. A person asks for more oil, another sends greetings, another complains of delay. There is something tender in these survivals because they were never written for us, yet they arrived anyway. They remind us that people in ancient cities and villages lived among the same small urgencies that still shape daily life, waiting for news, counting provisions, and hoping for a reply. Scripts evolved over time, and this evolution often reflects practical pressures as much as cultural change. Signs were simplified, merged, or reshaped for speed, clarity, and ease of use. In some cases, older forms remained in sacred or ceremonial settings, while newer forms became common in daily administration. Materials also mattered. A script suited to carving stone might differ from one used on reed, papyrus, leather, or wet clay. The physical act of writing shaped the form of letters and symbols. A sharp stylus leaves different marks than a brush or chisel. Repeated gestures, hand positions, and surface resistance all influenced how a script looked and how quickly it could be written. Ancient writing systems are therefore not just abstract codes. They are histories of touch, pressure, angle, and movement. In the curve of a sign or the angle of a wedge, one can sometimes sense the tool and the hand that made it. Some civilizations developed bilingual or multilingual writing traditions, and these are among the most revealing traces of ancient contact. Traders, diplomats, administrators, and empire builders often needed to communicate across language borders. A single inscription might appear in more than one language, or a local script might absorb foreign words and titles. Scribes adapted borrowed forms to new sounds, while rulers used multilingual inscriptions to address different communities at once. These documents show that the ancient world was rarely sealed off into neat cultural boxes. Instead, many societies lived in constant linguistic contact, with words passing through markets, courts, harbours, and caravan routes. A bilingual text is not just a record of communication. It is evidence of negotiation, translation, and coexistence, of people trying to be understood by more than one audience at the same time. Books, as we imagine them now, were not always the dominant format, and the variety of ancient formats shaped how knowledge was handled. Scrolls, tablets, bound codices, and stitched manuscripts each had their own strengths. A tablet might be durable and compact, a scroll easy to store in sequence, a codex quicker to consult, and a bundle of sheets convenient for portable reading. Format affected what could be hidden, copied, transporting, or read aloud. It also affected memory. A text arranged as a scroll unfolds in one direction, while a codex allows different kinds of searching and revisiting. The shape of the container influenced the shape of thought. Even before modern printing, people were already choosing between methods of preservation, convenience, and prestige. What survives to us is partly the story of which formats lasted longest in dry soil, tombs, libraries, and sealed rooms. And perhaps most beautifully, writing allowed the dead to continue speaking, or at least to remain present in a form that could be encountered again and again. A name on a tomb, a prayer on a wall, a poem copied by later hands, or a business record preserved in dry earth can carry someone beyond their lifetime. Ancient civilizations knew this, and many of their written traditions were built on the quiet hope that words might remain after the body and the city had changed. Sometimes the desire was personal, to be remembered by family, ancestors, or gods. Sometimes it was political, to preserve a ruler's name, a conquest, or a decree. Sometimes it was simply practical, a way of making sure that a boundary, a debt, or a ritual instruction would not vanish. But beneath all these uses is a gentler idea, one found in many places and periods, that human speech, once fixed in marks, can continue to travel forward. A voice may fall silent, but a line of writing can wait in the dark, patient and still, until another reader comes along. Trade in the ancient world was both ordinary and astonishing, woven quietly into the daily rhythm of life, and yet capable of connecting places that seemed impossibly far apart. A merchant might carry a few familiar goods only a short distance to a nearby market, passing from one village to the next along a road worn smooth by generations of feet and hooves. Or that same merchant might be part of a much larger system, one that linked inland towns to river harbours, coastal ports, caravan stations, and imperial capitals. In the ancient imagination, trade often had a practical, almost humble face: sacks of grain, jars of oil, bundles of cloth, baskets of fruit. But behind that modest image was a world of movement and coordination. Caravans crossed dry plains and desert edges. Ships hugged coastlines and timed their departures to winds and seasons. Riverboats, where rivers allowed it, drifted inland with cargo stacked carefully against the current of life. Trade routes were not fixed highways in the modern sense, marked forever on maps. They changed when rain failed, when a ruler raised tolls, when bandits became active, when a channel silted up, or when a better crossing was found. And yet these routes remained remarkably durable, because communities almost everywhere needed what neighbours could provide, whether that need was for food, stone, metal, cloth, timber, or something more symbolic and rare. Raw materials often travelled farther than finished objects, and this is one of the quiet truths of the ancient economy. A finished cup or blade might stay near the place it was made, while the tin, copper, salt, shell, pigment, or resin that helped create it had already crossed many borders of land and culture. Tin is a good example because it was often essential for bronze, yet tin sources were scarce in many regions. That meant a chain of exchange could begin in a distant mine, pass through several hands, and end in a workshop where metalworkers melted, mixed, and cast it into tools or ornaments. The same was true for cedar wood, prized for its scent and strength, or for aromatic resins burned in sacred spaces, or for gemstones that caught candlelight in a palace chamber. Salt, too, was a necessity that could become a commodity of wide value because it preserved food and supported travel. Textiles moved in the same way, especially if they were dyed, patterned, or made from fibers not locally available. When an archaeologist uncovers a luxury object in a tomb or palace, it is often tempting to admire it as a single thing, but the object usually represents an entire invisible chain of extraction, transport, storage, and exchange. Its form is local, yet its biography is broad, sometimes regional, sometimes international, and often shaped by many people whose names were never recorded. Ports were especially vibrant places, full of motion even in moments of stillness. Harbour cities gathered together sailors, dockworkers, inspectors, innkeepers, interpreters, packers, messengers, and merchants from different backgrounds, each with a role in the delicate business of moving goods from one vessel to another. The smell of a port would have been layered and unforgettable: tar, fish, rope, wet wood, animal feed, spices, sweat, and the briny air of the sea. Cargo had to be counted, unloaded, measured, stored, and redistributed, and all of that required coordination. Some goods were fragile, some valuable, some perishable, and some simply enormous. Seals helped show ownership or origin. Marks on jars or crates could indicate a workshop, a warehouse, a tax authority, or a royal administration. Inventories mattered because large systems depend on memory made visible. In many harbour cities, languages overlapped naturally. People from nearby regions and from much farther away might all stand on the same quay, bargaining in different tongues while watching gulls circle above the water. Ports were among the most cosmopolitan places in antiquity, not because they were polished or orderly, but because they were practical. They brought difference into close proximity, day after day, in the ordinary work of loading and unloading. Money itself evolved gradually, and it did not arrive all at once as a simple solution. In many early societies, barter remained important, especially in local exchange where people knew one another and trusted shared custom. Commodity exchange also mattered, using goods like grain, livestock, salt, metal, or cloth as standards of value. Weighed metal introduced another layer of efficiency, allowing small amounts of silver, gold, copper, or bronze to be measured against agreed scales. Later, coins made transactions easier and more standardized in many regions. A stamped piece of metal could travel through many hands without needing to be weighed each time, and that convenience changed the texture of market life. But coins were never only practical. They carried images of rulers, gods, animals, city emblems, or abstract signs. In that sense, money became a portable message of authority. It could quietly affirm that a ruler existed, that a city was powerful, or that a political order had the right to define value. A coin might pass from a soldier to a baker to a child to a temple offering box, and at every step it continued to repeat its tiny claim. Commerce and propaganda lived together in that small object, which is one reason coins remain so useful to historians. They are small, durable, and full of intention. Roads mattered as much as ships, though they often receive less attention because they seem so familiar. In the ancient world, roads were not always grand paved avenues. Some were built for armies so that troops and supplies could move with greater speed and control. Some served administration, allowing messengers and tax officials to reach distant settlements. Some followed the steps of pilgrims walking toward shrines, sacred mountains, or holy festivals. Others emerged simply because repeated use made a route visible and then reliable. Once a path became useful, it attracted more use, and then perhaps more maintenance, and eventually more formal recognition. Road systems allowed empires to act at a distance. They made it possible to carry orders, collect revenue, monitor outlying areas, and move soldiers when needed. A courier on a maintained road could cover ground far faster than a messenger forcing a way through rough terrain. Even so, most roads were vulnerable to weather, erosion, and neglect. Their strength lay not in permanence alone, but in repeated human attention. A road existed because enough people needed it enough often to keep it alive. Deserts were not empty, even when they looked empty from a distance. They were inhabited corridors, each with its own patterns of survival and movement. Travelers crossing a desert relied on guides who knew the location of wells, the timing of seasonal winds, the behavior of animals, and the subtle signs of changing terrain. In some regions, desert travel demanded remarkable discipline. Water had to be rationed carefully. Loads had to be balanced so animals would not weaken too quickly. Travel often occurred at cooler hours, with pauses during the hottest parts of the day. Stars could serve as companions and reference points in the dark, while distant rock formations or hardened tracks might guide the way by day. Oases became essential nodes of settlement and exchange, places where people and animals could rest, replenish, and trade news as well as supplies. In stories and folklore, deserts often appear as places of danger, testing, or revelation. They are imagined as places where one meets hardship or hears a divine voice. But in everyday life they were also practical spaces, structured by knowledge, timing, and cooperation. In many parts of the ancient world, the desert was not simply a barrier. It was a connective space, binding distant communities through patient, skilled travel. Mountains and sea passages created their own forms of exchange, each shaped by landscape and risk. Mountain routes often favored small, high-value goods that could justify the effort of transport. That might mean metals, medicinal plants, finely woven cloth, or precious stones. The people who lived in mountainous regions usually developed specialized knowledge of passes, weather shifts, and animal paths, knowledge that outsiders could not easily improvise. Maritime trade, by contrast, could move heavy cargo far more efficiently than land transport. A ship could carry jars of oil, stacks of timber, stone blocks, or grain in quantities no caravan could match, but the sea demanded its own discipline. Sailors had to watch the sky, the stars, the currents, the direction of the wind, and the shape of the coast. A sudden storm could scatter a convoy or force a vessel into an unfamiliar cove. Ancient civilizations adapted to their terrain rather than overcoming it completely. They learned what the land and water allowed and built their trade on those conditions. In that sense, trade networks were ecological as well as economic. They followed river flows, mountain passes, monsoon patterns, and harbor depths, all of which shaped the choices of people who lived long before modern engines or satellites. Diplomacy often moved with trade, and sometimes it rode on the same roads or sailed on the same ships. Gifts, tribute, marriage alliances, emissaries, and hostages all helped stabilize relationships between states, kingdoms, and city-states. A bronze vessel might be more than a beautiful container. It might be a statement of respect or a reminder of dependence. A decorated weapon might signify alliance or warning, while a ceremonial garment could mark status in a foreign court. In many ancient societies, exchange was deeply ceremonial. It was not only about finding a fair price, it was about recognizing rank, maintaining balance, and avoiding insult. A gift could create obligation. A tribute payment could preserve peace. A marriage between ruling families might open a corridor for merchants, travelers, and envoys. Even when tension existed, trade could continue in limited form because both sides understood its usefulness. Human relationships, especially between states, were often maintained through repeated gestures rather than single dramatic moments. Exchange was one of those gestures, and its language could be subtle. A ruler who accepted a gift accepted a relationship, even if only for a season. The spread of ideas through trade was subtle but profound, and it often left traces that are easy to overlook unless one knows where to look. Religious symbols could travel alongside goods, appearing first in familiar contexts and then in new ones with slight changes in shape or meaning. Artistic styles moved as well. A pattern on a pot, a way of carving a face, a preferred stance for a figure in relief, or a new arrangement of color and line. Numerical systems and accounting methods could spread because merchants needed them, and once adopted they might become useful to officials, scribes, and temple administrators. Technical tricks moved too. A method of glazing pottery, a way of alloying metal, or a technique for weaving might pass from one workshop tradition to another without any grand announcement. Sometimes a pot shape copied in a distant land means migration, and sometimes it means admiration, practical convenience, or a worker simply repeating what seemed effective. Material culture carries memory more quietly than written documents do, yet often far more widely. A style can outlive the people who first made it. A motif can travel farther than a story, and because objects circulate through many hands, they often preserve evidence of contact where the texts are silent. And sometimes trade preserved fragility, giving rare and delicate things a long journey and a long life. A dried fruit might survive because it was sealed in a jar and packed carefully for transport. A rare pigment might be prized not because it was common in itself, but because it came from a distant source and had to be processed with care. A shell from a far-off coast might be turned into jewelry inland, carrying with it the memory of tides and salt water. Incense from a remote forest could fill a temple with smoke that seemed to make the air itself sacred. In those cases, distance became part of value. A thing did not simply cost what it was made of, it also carried the expense of movement, the risk of loss, the labor of guards and carriers, and the trust needed to move it through many regions. Ancient trade had a way of turning remoteness into desirability. The farther something had come, the more story it seemed to hold. And perhaps that is one reason trade felt so powerful in the ancient world. It made unseen places present. It let people touch what they could not have imagined reaching them. War was a recurring force in ancient history, but it did not look exactly the same in every civilization. In one place it might begin with the thunder of chariots racing across a plain, while elsewhere it depended on massed infantry, disciplined archers, or ships moving quietly along a coast at dawn. The shape of battle was always tied to landscape and to the materials a society could work with. Bronze blades, spearheads, and armor were prized for a long time, especially where copper and tin could be acquired and smelted reliably. In many regions, iron gradually became more common, not because it was always better at first, but because it was more widely available and could be made in larger quantities. Shields were shaped to fit local tactics. Helmets were made to balance protection and vision. Even the way soldiers stood in line or advanced in groups reflected a civilization's resources, training, and imagination. Ancient war was never just brute force. It was also engineering, planning, and adaptation to the world around it. Military power was often closely tied to state organization. To raise armies, rulers needed food stores, labor systems, roads, records, and loyalty. A king or governor could not simply declare war and expect soldiers to appear fully supplied. Grain had to be collected in advance, animals had to be driven or loaded, bronze or iron had to be processed into weapons, and messengers had to carry orders across distances that could be vast by ancient standards. In this sense, war depended on peacetime administration. Taxation, scribal record keeping, and controlled storage were not separate from military life. They were its hidden support structure. Even the most dramatic battle stood on a foundation of accounting and supply. Soldiers had to be paid, fed, moved, and replaced. If a campaign stalled, it might not be because of enemy bravery alone, but because carts broke, rivers flooded, or grain ran short. In ancient history, logistics was often the quiet force behind victory or collapse. Fortresses and watchpoints reveal how seriously ancient states treated vulnerability. A hilltop stronghold could see for miles, watching roads, valleys, and river crossings. A gatehouse at a mountain pass could control travel for a whole region. Some fortifications were modest, made from packed earth or timber, while others were enormous, built from stone blocks, mud brick, or layered defenses that enclosed entire towns. Their design often followed the natural shape of the land. A cliff could become a wall. A river bend could become a barrier. Marshes, ravines, and narrow passes all reduced the need for massive construction, and ancient builders understood this with practical intelligence. A fortress was not only a military object, it was also a statement that a community expected danger and had organized itself to meet it. The remains of walls, ditches, towers, and gates still suggest a constant conversation between engineering and geography. Defense in antiquity was rarely about one perfect barrier. It was about combining many small advantages until a place became difficult to attack. Sieges were especially difficult. Surrounding a city meant patience, scarcity, and pressure rather than quick movement. The attackers had to bring food, water, tools, and shelter for themselves, while trying to cut off the same things from the defenders. Food stores inside the walls could run low. Wells might be blocked or poisoned. Water channels could be threatened if they could be reached at all. Disease often spread where crowds were trapped together for long periods. Smoke, waste, fear, and exhaustion could shape daily life as much as weapons did. The people inside walls might endure weeks or months of uncertainty, listening for signals from outside, hoping for rescue or bracing for assault. Archaeology sometimes preserves the traces of such strain in collapsed defenses, burned layers, shattered storage jars, or repairs made in haste. Ancient texts occasionally describe sieges in dramatic language, but the physical evidence often speaks more quietly. It shows labor, hunger, improvisation, and endurance. A siege could become a memory that lasted for generations, especially if a city survived or fell in a way that entered local legend. Yet ancient warfare was not only destruction. It also helped spread technologies, languages, and political structures. Conquest could move artisans, scribes, metalworkers, and soldiers into new regions, A defeated population might be resettled, incorporated, or forced to serve a new ruler, but the result was not always simple replacement. Often it was mixture. Administrative styles could travel with conquerors. Foreign gods might be honored in a new capital. Styles of dress, language, and art could blend over time into forms that belonged fully to neither side at the beginning. Empires often emerged from repeated military expansion, but they survived only if they could organize what they had taken. They needed local intermediaries, tax systems, and some degree of acceptance from conquered communities. The ancient world was full of mixtures born from conflict, and many of its most enduring cultures were shaped in the slow aftermath of war rather than in battle itself. Navies and river fleets also played important roles. Water transport could move troops, grain, timber, stone, and messages more efficiently than land routes in many circumstances. A river might function like a road, carrying goods downstream in a way that horses and carts could not match. Along seas and large lakes, ships made it possible to connect distant cities, colonies, and ports with surprising speed. For that reason, harbors, estuaries, and river mouths became strategic places of contest. Whoever controlled them could often control trade, taxation, and movement. Naval warfare was not always fought in the grand scale imagined by later eras. Sometimes it involved the interception of supply boats, the guarding of channels, or the seizure of dockyards and anchorages. Coastal communities learned to read the water, the wind, and the horizon with great care. In many ancient civilizations, control of water meant control of supply, and control of supply often meant control of power. Armor and weapons were deeply symbolic. A shield could display a city's emblem, a clan mark, a painted pattern, or a religious symbol intended to offer protection. A helmet could indicate rank, region, or elite status. A sword might serve in combat, but it might also appear in ritual, burial, or display. In some cultures, weapons were dedicated to temples after victories, perhaps as offerings to divine forces believed to have guided the outcome. In tombs, weapons sometimes accompany the dead, even when it is unclear whether they were used in battle or chosen to represent honor and identity. Objects associated with war were therefore not merely tools. They were part of memory and ceremony. They could speak of courage, authority, ancestry, and prestige. To hold such an object was to carry a story, and perhaps also to claim a place within a social order built partly on the threat of force. Some ancient societies used mercenaries or allied troops from outside their core population. This gave rulers flexibility. A kingdom might hire skilled archers from one frontier, cavalry from another, or sailors from a different coast. Such arrangements could strengthen an army quickly, especially when local manpower was limited, but they also created complicated loyalties. Soldiers might serve for pay, for land, for promises, for obligations to a patron, or simply because conflict gave them opportunity. Their identity might be layered rather than singular. They could fight for a city that was not their birthplace, under leaders whose language they only partly shared. This is one reason military history is also social history. Armies were made of farmers, herders, captives, veterans, and migrants. Their service reveals how states managed dependence on diverse groups, and how ancient power often rested on negotiation as much as command. Peace treaties, borders, and tribute systems show that diplomacy was always present even when conflict dominated the record. Ancient rulers did not spend all their energy fighting. They negotiated marriages, exchanged gifts, swore oaths, set limits on trade, and recognized spheres of influence. A treaty might be carved in stone, written on clay or parchment, or remembered through ritual repeated in public. Borders were not always fixed lines like modern maps. They could be zones, river edges, mountain ranges, or areas where one authority faded into another. Tribute systems sometimes replaced direct rule, allowing a local leader to remain in place if payments or obligations were met. In this way, ancient states often preferred managed stability over endless expansion. A quiet frontier could be as valuable as a battlefield victory. The ability to pause conflict, even temporarily, was itself a sign of political maturity. Ancient civilizations understood in their own way that endurance often came from compromise. And perhaps the quietest truth of all is that most people in ancient societies wanted the same thing we do now: enough food, safety for family, some stability, and a future that would continue. The record left by kings, generals, and inscriptions can make ancient history seem dominated by conquest, but behind those names were ordinary households trying to keep grain dry, repair tools, raise children, and survive changing seasons. Many lives were spent far from palaces and battlefields, in fields, workshops, kitchens, courtyards, and riverbanks. Even when kingdoms rose and fell, people still needed bread, water, shelter, and sleep. They still worried about illness, weather, debt, and loss. War is one part of the ancient world's story, but survival was the larger one. Beneath the victories and ruins, the longer rhythm was always daily life continuing as best it could, gently, stubbornly, and for as long as it was possible. Art in ancient civilizations was often functional as well as beautiful. A painted bowl might do more than hold food. It could celebrate a familiar myth, signal the standing of a household, or turn an ordinary meal into something ceremonial and shared. A carved relief might praise a king, record a victory, protect a sacred space, or simply give a wall a sense of presence and order. In many ancient cultures, art was not divided as sharply as it is today into separate categories of decoration, storytelling, and worship. The same object could serve several purposes at once, moving quietly between the practical and the symbolic. A vessel might be useful in daily life, then later be buried with its owner, carrying meaning into the afterlife. Wall painting might delight the eye, but also reassure the viewer that the world was arranged according to divine patterns. Ancient art was rarely made for a single kind of appreciation. It lived in homes, temples, tombs, streets, and palaces, part of the ordinary atmosphere of life. Portraits and sculptures are especially revealing because they show ideals as much as likeness. Rulers often wanted to appear calm, enduring, and carefully composed, almost beyond the ordinary limits of age or emotion. Their faces might be smooth and serene, their posture upright, their bodies balanced in ways that suggested power without visible strain. In many cases, the goal was not strict realism, but a convincing kind of authority. Even when a figure was not a king, the artist might still shape the body to express dignity, gravity, or role. Ancient sculpture often used subtle conventions: a certain tilt of the head, a particular arrangement of hands, a stance that implied readiness or reverence. These choices helped viewers read the image quickly and clearly. A portrait could preserve memory, but it could also declare what a person ought to be. Ancient artists cared deeply about proportion, gesture, and symbolic clarity. A face did not need to be photographically exact to feel meaningful. Patterns and ornament were central to many artistic traditions. Repeated motifs such as spirals, lotus forms, vines, meanders, animals, rosettes, and geometric borders created visual rhythm that could be calm, lively, or solemn. Some patterns were inherited across centuries, slowly changing as they traveled from one region to another. Others may have reflected religious ideas, ideas of fertility, cosmic order, or the balance between chaos and control. In many places, ornament also served practical visual needs. Repetition could unify large surfaces, making a pottery rim, a woven cloth, or a painted wall feel complete and balanced. It could guide the eye, allowing a viewer to move slowly from one form to the next. Scholars sometimes debate the original meaning of specific motifs, and in many cases the meaning may have varied by time and setting. A lotus could be a sacred sign, a decorative flourish, or both. A border might simply please the maker, while also echoing older forms of protection. The pleasure of pattern was part of its power. The eye could rest in it, wander through it, and feel the quiet order it created. Pigments and materials shaped artistic expression in lasting ways. Ancient artisans worked with mineral colors, shell inlays, gold leaf, colored glass, ivory, obsidian, polished stone, clay, wood, and fibers of many kinds. Each material brought its own texture, weight, and shine. Some colors were expensive because the raw ingredients were rare or had to be brought from far away. Others were common, but still required skill to prepare and bind. A deep blue might come from carefully ground stone or from a demanding trade network that reached across deserts and seas. A bright red might be startlingly vivid when first applied, then soften over centuries. The survival of ancient art often depends on chemical luck. Some pigments withstand sunlight, moisture, and time better than others. Some objects were protected in sealed tombs or dry climates, while others vanished almost completely. When we see a surviving fragment of ancient color, we are looking at a rare witness. It is easy to imagine the larger painted world that once existed around it, full of walls, wooden panels, fabrics, and objects now gone. Music, though harder to preserve, must have filled ancient spaces richly. Drums, flutes, lyres, harps, pipes, bells, and rattles appear in images and remains across many regions, suggesting that sound was woven deeply into ritual and daily life. Music likely accompanied processions, feasts, mourning, healing ceremonies, agricultural work, and the rhythms of court life. It could mark sacred time, soften grief, encourage labor, or create a shared mood among a crowd. Because instruments are fragile, much of ancient music is lost to silence, and scholars must reconstruct it from depictions, fragments, and later traditions. We may never know the exact melodies that once drifted through courtyards or temple halls. Still, the evidence shows that music was not a minor ornament of civilization. It helped shape memory and belonging. A child might learn songs connected to a place, a god, or a family tradition. A community might recognize itself through familiar rhythms. Even where the instruments are gone, the idea of music remains embedded in reliefs, poems, and written records. Dance and performance were equally important. Festive processions, ritual movements, mourning dances, court entertainments, and public displays all shaped social life in ancient cities and villages. Performance gathered people together and made belief visible in motion. A religious rite might involve steps, turns, gestures, and pauses whose meaning was understood by participants, even if it is only partly recoverable now. A procession through a city could temporarily transform streets into sacred space, filling them with incense, music, banners, and the slow movement of bodies. In some cultures, dance may have echoed myths of death and rebirth, or the cycles of the seasons. In others, it could honor a ruler, celebrate a harvest, or express communal grief. The body itself became part of civilization's language. Arms lifted, feet stamped, lines formed and dissolved. The motion may have been lively or restrained, public or intimate, formal or ecstatic. However it was performed, it made abstract beliefs feel immediate and shared. Clothing and adornment reveal subtle social codes. Jewelry, cosmetics, hairstyles, belts, shoes, headdresses, and woven patterns all communicated status, gender, age, profession, region, or religious role. In warm climates, clothing might be light and practical, while in cooler or more formal settings it could be layered, dyed, or decorated to emphasize rank. Some fashions were everyday choices shaped by local materials and weather. Others were highly ceremonial, reserved for rulers, priests, brides, mourners, or festival participants. Small objects like beads, pins, combs, mirrors, rings, and bracelets can tell us a great deal about how people wish to be seen. They also hint at daily routines that rarely appear in grand history. A jar of pigment or a carefully shaped clasp suggests private acts of preparation before public life. A hairstyle preserved in sculpture may have taken time, patience, and help from others. Ancient adornment was not always about vanity. It could express belonging, protection, piety, or the simple human desire to appear well-formed in the eyes of one's community. Public art was often deeply political. Statues, monuments, victory scenes, processional reliefs, and royal inscriptions reminded viewers who held power, who had conquered whom. and which institutions were meant to endure. A stone image placed in a square or temple entrance could speak without words. It could announce divine favor, military success, ancestry, or loyalty. Yet public art could also honor gods, ancestors, and civic ideals. It might teach obedience, but it could also offer shared pride and continuity. The visual landscape of a city was a kind of lesson. To walk through an ancient capital was to pass through messages made of stone, color, scale, and placement. Some displays were meant to overwhelm, others invited reverence. Some were open to many eyes, while others would have been seen only by elites or ritual participants. Scholars often study how these images were arranged in space, because location mattered as much as content. A statue inside a temple spoke differently from one placed at a gate or along a road. Public art helped turn authority into something visible, repeatable, and part of daily life. Even tiny objects could be works of art. Seals, amulets, earrings, beads, carved figurines, and miniature vessels often show astonishing detail at a very small scale. Their size invited touch, close attention, and repeated handling. Some were worn every day, making them intimate companions. Others were placed in burials, hidden in homes, or offered in shrines. The tiny surface of a seal might carry an image of animals, gods, riders, or symbols compressed into a space no larger than a fingernail. An amulet might be intended not only to adorn, but to protect. A bead might travel through many hands before being strung into a necklace or sewn into cloth. These small objects remind us that beauty in antiquity was not reserved for the monumental. In some ways, the most personal art was also the most carefully made. The person who wore it may have felt its weight, its coolness, or its smooth edge against the skin each day. Such objects were often quiet, but they were never insignificant. And when we look at the surviving art of ancient civilizations, we are seeing both endurance and loss. Many masterpieces have vanished, many colors have faded, many wooden forms have decayed, many textiles have broken apart, many painted surfaces have flaked away, and many original settings have been buried or destroyed. What remains is only a fraction of the visual world that once surrounded people. Archaeology can recover pieces, but not always whole scenes. Museums preserve some treasures, while countless others survive only in descriptions, sketches, or damaged fragments. Even so, the surviving fraction is enough to suggest how visually rich the ancient world truly was. People lived among crafted surfaces, meaningful objects, and carefully staged images. Their environments were often dense with symbol, color, and material attention. The silence of what is missing can make the remaining works feel even more precious. They stand as small windows into worlds that were once fully alive with image, texture, and form. Ancient civilizations were never perfectly still. They were always moving, even when their monuments seemed permanent. Cities expanded, shrank, emptied, or were rebuilt. Villages changed allegiance. Trade routes shifted. Dynasties rose with confidence and then loosened, sometimes after generations of pressure that no single chronicler could fully explain. A kingdom might appear stable in one century and deeply altered in the next, not because history had stopped and restarted, but because people, resources, and ideas had slowly rearranged themselves. In the ancient world, decline was rarely a clean collapse. More often it was a long adjustment, a gradual thinning of power, followed by adaptation, migration, absorption, or replacement. Some places endured by changing their names, their rulers, or even their gods. Others survived in memory long after their streets had gone quiet. Climate was one of the quiet forces behind many of these changes. Rainfall could strengthen a farming region or weaken it. Rivers could flood in helpful ways, then later overrun fields, or move away from channels that had supported settlements for centuries. A cooler season, a prolonged dry spell, or the slow drift of weather patterns could influence harvests, trade, and political order. Ancient people did not have satellites or weather maps, but they understood the land with close attention. They watched clouds, winds, river levels, soil, and the behavior of animals. They knew that weather could bless a year or break it. When drought arrived, it was not only an agricultural problem, it could become a moral crisis, a family hardship, and a public concern all at once. Famine might follow, people might leave their homes, local authorities might lose trust. Rituals were often performed to ask for rain, restore balance, or interpret the meaning of hardship. Climate history, in that sense, is human history viewed through the slow rhythm of the earth. Disease shaped ancient life in equally powerful ways. Crowded settlements, animals kept close to homes, limited sanitation, and long roads of movement all created conditions where illness could spread. Epidemics could travel with traders, armies, migrants, or pilgrims. A sickness might appear in one neighborhood and then quietly move through an entire region. Ancient people did not know about microbes, but they were not helpless observers. They saw that illness followed patterns. They noticed that certain fevers came in waves, that some wounds became dangerous, and that childbed complications could be severe. Healers developed remedies through experience, tradition, and careful watching. Some treatments were practical, such as cleaning a wound, applying herbs, resting the body, or using compresses. Other treatments included prayer, incantation, amulets, or offerings to divine powers. Ancient medicine was often a mixture of observation and belief. That mixture may seem unfamiliar now, yet it reflects a very human effort to bring order to suffering when explanation was incomplete. Water management affected health, comfort, and the daily rhythm of entire cities. A community needed wells, cisterns, drainage channels, latrines, and access to water that was reasonably clean. Without such systems, waste could gather, insects could multiply, and disease could become more common. With them, urban life became more sustainable. Some ancient cities had impressive engineering for gathering and moving water. Channels carried runoff away from streets. Public baths offered washing and social contact. Drainage systems protected storage areas and homes. In other places, simpler local practices did the work. Careful waste disposal, seasonal cleaning, household wells, or shared rules about where animals could be kept. The details varied widely, but the principle was constant. Healthy infrastructure made organized society possible. Even now, when we study ancient settlements, traces of water systems tell us how people lived, how they planned, and how seriously they treated the ordinary need for cleanliness. Migration was not a rare disruption in antiquity. It was one of the normal conditions of ancient life. People moved for many reasons and sometimes for several at once. They relocated for trade, marriage, labor, military service, religious pilgrimage, or because drought and conflict left them with few other choices. Families crossed regions. Craftspeople followed markets. Captives were transporting far from home. Merchants set up seasonal routes. Nomadic groups met settled communities, and both changed in response. These movements carried much more than bodies from one place to another. They carried languages, recipes, stories, techniques, musical styles, religious habits, and ideas about authority. A new arrival might begin as a stranger and later become part of the local fabric. This is one reason ancient civilizations are so rarely pure or isolated. They were blended through contact. Civilization spread not only by conquest but by everyday life, by people seeking safety, opportunity, kinship, and a place where the future might feel a little more secure. Borderlands were often especially lively places in the ancient world. At the edge of empires or between rival regions, people had to negotiate difference every day. A frontier town might hear several languages in its market. Its clothing styles might reflect multiple traditions. Its food could blend local ingredients with imported tastes. Its religious practices might honor more than one pantheon or one set of sacred customs. These places were not simply halfway points between civilizations. They were active zones of creation, where communities borrowed, adapted, and reassembled traditions in practical ways. Borderlands often produced bilingual inscriptions, mixed artistic styles, and hybrid political arrangements. They remind us that culture is not always made at the center of power. Sometimes the most inventive societies emerge at the edges, where people must translate, compromise, and live with complexity. In those spaces, identity was often flexible, and belonging could have many layers. Chronology in ancient history can be surprisingly difficult. Modern readers often want exact dates, clear sequences, and firm labels, but the evidence does not always cooperate. Some rulers are known only from damaged inscriptions or scattered references. Some events are preserved in later copies rather than original records. Some archaeological layers are hard to separate cleanly, especially when settlements were rebuilt many times on the same ground. Scholars therefore work with probabilities, comparisons, and careful interpretation. They study pottery styles, carbon dates, seal impressions, king lists, astronomical references, and written fragments, then fit the pieces together as best they can. This does not make ancient history vague in a careless sense. It makes it subtle. It asks us to listen patiently. A ruined wall may tell part of a story. A broken tablet may hold a name. A burial may suggest movement or continuity. The past often arrives in fragments, and part of historical skill is learning to respect uncertainty without losing confidence in the larger pattern. Some of the greatest discoveries from the ancient world survived because nature preserved them in unexpected ways. Dry desert air could protect textiles, wooden objects, papyri, and even food remains. A sealed tomb could preserve a painted chamber, a statue, or a set of offerings. Volcanic ash could bury a city and shelter its walls from later weather. Mud, ice, or underwater sediment could slow decay and hide harbors, tools, and ships for centuries. The survival of the past is deeply uneven. What we know is shaped by what endured, not only by what once existed. This means that some civilizations seem more visible simply because their remains were protected better than others. A culture may have been rich and complex, yet leave only faint traces if its buildings were built of perishable materials or if its landscape was repeatedly disturbed. Archaeology teaches humility in this way. It reminds us that absence in the record is not always absence in history. Often it is only silence where preservation failed. The legacy of ancient civilizations lives on in many ordinary things. Laws, alphabets, religious texts, architectural forms, calendar systems, legal ideas, city plans, and literary themes all carry traces of earlier worlds. Sometimes the connection is direct and easy to follow. Sometimes it is indirect, filtered through many later centuries. A modern road may follow an ancient route. A judicial concept may echo older codes. A myth may survive in altered form inside a later story. Even the shape of a column, the layout of a square, or the structure of a ceremonial procession can preserve something old while feeling completely natural to us now. This is one reason ancient history remains so present. Its influence is often invisible because it has become part of the background of daily life. We use inherited systems without always recognizing their age. The past can hide inside the familiar, and so the ancient world remains both far away and close at hand. It is far away in time, in language, in custom, and in the missing pieces of its record. Yet it is close in the things that mattered most. Ancient people cared about food, shelter, family, honor, memory, illness, justice, fear, hope, and meaning. They watched the sky and worried about the harvest. They raised children, buried the dead, told stories, and tried to make sense of change. Their tools were different from ours, and their explanations often followed different paths, but their questions were deeply human. In that way, ancient history is not only about lost kingdoms or ruined temples, it is also about recognition. When we look closely, we can still see a familiar life beneath the dust, moving slowly through time, searching for stability and leaving behind traces for us to find. One reason ancient civilizations still fascinate us is that they survive in fragments, and fragments invite imagination. A shard of pottery, a broken statue, a line of text, a buried room A soot-marked wall or a damaged seal can suggest an entire world beyond itself. Archaeology is often the patient art of reconstructing a whole from what remains. Each object is small, but together they create a broad and textured picture of human life. A single piece can carry so much quiet information. The curve of a rim may hint at how a vessel was used. The wear on a doorway threshold may reveal how often people crossed it. A stain in the earth can mark a hearth long vanished, and a pile of discarded shells can suggest a meal, a market, or a season of abundance. Even the absence of objects can be meaningful. A room with very little inside it may have been emptied deliberately, abandoned in haste, or simply cleaned before it was sealed beneath later layers. Ancient worlds are often read like palimpsests, written over again and again, with each generation leaving traces under the next. The study of ancient civilizations is also collaborative. Archaeologists, historians, linguists, conservators, chemists, geographers, and anthropologists all contribute different kinds of insight. Some read inscriptions, some analyze soil, some examine pigments or tool marks, some compare myths and traditions. Ancient history is not one discipline looking down on the past. It is many disciplines gathering around it with careful attention. That shared effort matters because no single method can reveal everything. A text may tell us what an elite official wanted remembered, while a buried kitchen tells a different story about daily life. A tomb can reveal beliefs about death, but a trash pit can reveal what people actually ate. A royal monument may project power, yet the wear patterns on tools can speak more quietly about labor and routine. Scholars often move back and forth between these kinds of evidence, trying to balance what is declared publicly with what is preserved accidentally. In that balance, ancient life becomes more human and less distant. Many discoveries are still being made. New excavation methods, satellite imaging, DNA analysis, and digital reconstruction continue to change how we understand old societies. Entire sites can be mapped beneath sand, vegetation, or urban development. What looked settled a generation ago may shift again as evidence improves. The ancient world is not finished with us yet. Sometimes the newest tools uncover old surprises in the most unexpected places. A faint outline seen from above can suggest roads or walls no one noticed on the ground. A chemical trace in a vessel can hint at oils, grains, perfumes, or medicines long evaporated away. Ancient bones can reveal migration, disease, diet, or family relationship. And digital models can bring collapsed architecture into view, helping us imagine how sunlight once entered a courtyard, how a temple door may have opened, or how a city might have looked from a riverbank at dawn. Each method adds a layer, though none brings perfect certainty. Even the best evidence leaves room for careful interpretation. At the same time, interpretation must remain humble. Not every ruin is a mystery, and not every mystery will be solved. Some things are simply gone. That absence is part of history too. It reminds us that the past was once full of living people whose homes, voices, and routines were as immediate to them as ours are to us now. There is a particular kind of respect in admitting uncertainty. Ancient objects do not always speak clearly, and modern readers can be too eager to make them say too much. A pattern in the dirt may have been a ritual boundary, or it may have been practical drainage. A carved image may show a deity, a ruler, a symbol, or a local variation that no longer has an obvious name. Sometimes the most responsible answer is to say that we do not know yet. That patience is not failure. It is part of how knowledge grows without forcing the past into simple shapes. There is a quiet beauty in that realization. Ancient civilizations were not abstract categories. They were communities of parents, children, workers, rulers, merchants, farmers, builders, and storytellers. They laughed, worried, planned, and endured. They made objects that lasted, and they made others that vanished almost at once. Their world was both fragile and astonishingly durable. The ordinary details can feel especially moving when we pause long enough to notice them. A child might have scratched lines into a wall. A cook might have ground spices beside a small clay stove. A weaver might have worked with dyed thread in dim afternoon light. A merchant may have counted weights in an open stall while dust drifted across the street. These scenes are not always recorded in grand monuments, but they are often present in the evidence, waiting to be recognized. Ancient civilization was not only built by famous names. It was sustained by habits repeated quietly, day after day, in homes and workshops and fields. The scale of their ambition can still feel almost dreamlike. They raised monuments, carved laws, mapped stars, counted grain, wrote epics, crossed deserts, and sailed between continents. Yet they also swept courtyards, kneaded dough, mended nets, poured libations, and tucked small amulets into clothing. Civilization is most fully understood when both scales are held together, the monumental and the everyday. That duality appears again and again across the ancient world. A palace might have stood near storage rooms packed with grain. A ceremonial avenue might have led past ordinary houses where someone was repairing sandals. A royal inscription might boast of conquest while nearby, farmers were waiting on seasonal floods or watching for rain clouds. Great power and ordinary survival often existed side by side. People lived within grand systems, but they also lived within the rhythm of meals, weather, illness, family, and work. It is easy to remember the monuments. It is harder, and often more important, to remember the lived texture around them. Folklore and memory also shape how these civilizations endure in the modern imagination. Stories told long after a kingdom has fallen may preserve a name, a place, or a moral lesson, even when the details have blurred. Later cultures sometimes inherited fragments of ancient belief, adapting them into new traditions. A god may become a local saint in folk memory. A ruined city may turn into the site of a legend about pride, punishment, or hidden treasure. Such stories are not always historically precise, but they carry emotional truth about how people relate to the past. They show that ruins are never only archaeological. They are also imaginative spaces where communities return to explain loss, continuity, and wonder. There is something soothing in the way these stories accumulate. A line from a tablet, a proverb remembered in another language, a tale attached to a mountain or river, and a shrine rebuilt over older foundations can all suggest that memory does not end cleanly. It drifts, merges, and survives in altered form. Ancient civilizations are therefore not only studied in museums and excavation trenches, they also live in place names, customs, symbols, and repeated stories that have traveled through centuries of retelling. This is why so much ancient history is about atmosphere as much as fact. We imagine the smell of wet earth after floodwaters recede, the dust of a road at midday, the coolness of stone in a shaded corridor, the flicker of flame on a painted wall, the rustle of reeds along a canal. We imagine voices in markets, the scrape of tools, the soft sound of grain being poured, the weight of a bronze vessel, the press of crowds during a festival. Some of these details come from direct evidence, and some are educated reconstruction. Together, they help us sense not only what these civilizations built, but what it may have felt like to inhabit them. The most enduring achievements were often built through careful repetition rather than sudden brilliance alone. Irrigation systems required maintenance, roads needed repair, roofs had to be thatched or sealed, calendars had to be tracked against the seasons, writing had to be copied, taught, and preserved. A civilization is not a single act of creation. It is a long continuity of maintenance. The people who kept systems functioning may have been less celebrated than the rulers who claimed them, yet without them, the entire structure would have faded much sooner. In that sense, the ancient world was held together by patience, and perhaps that is why these old worlds remain so restful to think about at night. Their stories are large enough to wander through slowly, but familiar enough to feel human. The more carefully we listen, the more they become less like ruins and more like echoes of ordinary life continuing far away. The calm of that thought comes from recognition. The people of antiquity did not know they were living in ancient history. They were simply living. They woke to tasks, worried about weather and debt, celebrated births and harvests, buried their dead, and hoped for protection from visible and invisible dangers. A father could be proud of a child's progress in writing. A grandmother could remember rituals learned from her own elders. A builder could measure stones by hand and trust the line of a plumb bob. Across distance and time, these gestures still feel approachable. They make the past less like a museum case and more like a dimly lit room where human life is still recognizable. So as this gentle journey comes to a close, let the images soften in your mind. Riverbanks at dawn, clay tablets drying in the sun, lamp smoke in a quiet room, sandals on a stone floor, and distant stars measured by patient eyes. The ancient world fades slowly but never completely. It lingers wherever people keep memory and wherever a story is told with care.